All right, so I'm going to mute you and share my screen. Um, and we'll watch this video, and then um, remember, if anything kind of sticks out to you that you want further clarification on, remember that. That'll be our first question when we get to that part.
Okay.
Hey, welcome back! This is the Space Between YouTube series, in which we're exploring the space between the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures. Except now, we're no longer in the space between, as we are thoroughly implanted in the New Testament era. Last week we talked about King Herod the Great, the final king of the Jews. Well, mostly final, but we'll get to that later. This guy was this paranoid, violent megalomaniac who was also really good at schmoozing with the Romans in charge and having these massive building projects that would change the landscape of Judea for, well, until now even. Now, this guy, he had 10 wives that we know of and at least 14 children that we know of. They didn't really keep great track of all of the female children. And many of these children and wives were either imprisoned or executed or disowned or kicked out, or he was not the best dad, as you can imagine. And towards the end of his life, he changed around his will. He revised this document so many times that it gets kind of hard to figure out what he actually wanted to do with the kingdom after he died. And it also gets super confusing for historians because, well, and just anyone really who's reading it, because some of Herod's children were actually named Herod, whereas other children took the name Herod as a title. Similarly to the way that, Caesar would be a title, they just turned Herod from a name into a title. So you've got all these Herods running around, and a lot of them, their names aren't even Herod. So when you're reading the New Testament and you read about a King Herod, you could be hearing about any number of them. I think there's four different King Herods in the New Testament. I might be getting that wrong. There's a lot of King Herods in the New Testament. So I want to break it down for you, okay? Because in 4 BC, Herod finally died after a 35-year reign, and it wasn't pretty. He wasn't a good guy, so historians didn't give him a very good death. This is how Josephus describes his death, on a side note. After this, the distemper seized upon his whole body and greatly disordered all of its parts with various symptoms. For there was a gentle fever upon him, a gentle fever, isn't that nice? And an intolerable itching all over the surface of his body, and continual pains in his colon, and dropsical turnouts on his feet, and an inflammation of the abdomen, and a putrefaction of his private parts, that produced worms. Besides which, he had a difficulty of breathing upon him, and he could not breathe but when he sat upright, and had a convulsion of all his members. And even then, he still tried to live for a while afterwards. This guy was the worst. But in 4 BC, he finally died. And in his final will, he split up his kingdom into 3 parts for his three of his favorite children to rule over. And I'll give you a brief overview of these people. Philip ruled over the northeastern region, and he will have no impact on the New Testament. So, one less name we have to think about. Forget Philip altogether. The next one was Herod Antipas. This is the one who ruled over Galilee and Perea. This is the guy that beheads John the Baptist, because John the Baptist spoke out about the fact that he stole Philip's wife, or someone's wife. He stole someone's wife and then was enamored with his daughter and sister, brother, aunt, uncle. They're all related. They all married each other, and it gets very confusing. This is also the guy that during Jesus' trial they bring before him, because he's from Galilee, and so he's under Herod's jurisdiction, and Jesus refuses to answer any of his questions. That's this guy, Herod Antipas. More on him another day. in Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. So this is the biggest chunk of the kingdom. This is where the majority of people are, where the majority of the commerce is. This is the important part of the kingdom. This goes to his son, Herod Archelaus. And Herod ordered in his will that Archelaus would be given the title of king after him. The other ones would be tetrarchs, but he would be the king. And at Herod's death, there was a whole bunch of civil unrest in Jerusalem because there was this whole thing I mentioned last week where they tore down this golden eagle that Herod put on the temple, and then Herod had all these people killed and these beloved teachers and young men, and really overreacted in the way that Herods generally do. And the people were very upset, and they publicly demonstrated nonviolently and showed their frustration, and Herod Archelaus responded by sending in the army into Jerusalem, and like 3,000 people died. So the people of Judea were not big fans of Archelaus. This was how he was starting his term, was by killing everyone and bringing in the army. And they also accused him of, like, hey, your dad just died. You haven't even officially been made king yet, but here you are acting like a king. How can we trust you? So because Judea was a Roman kingdom now, the three brothers had to sail to Rome to meet with Caesar Augustus and to go over the will and to make sure that everything was in order and that Rome would issue all of the, proclamations. And because Archelaus was so unpopular, there was also a contingent of Jews who went to argue that he not be given the kingdom because he's awful. He's like as bad-tempered and bloodthirsty as his father with none of the diplomatic skills. You know what? In Luke 19, I believe, Jesus actually uses this in one of his parables. This is our text for this coming week, too. He says in Luke 19, "A man of noble birth went to a distant country to have himself appointed king and then to return. So he called 10 of his servants and gave them 10 minas. 'Put this money to work,' he said, 'until I come back.' But his subjects hated him and sent a delegation after him to say, 'We don't want this man to be our king.' He was made king, however, and returned home. Then he sent for the servants to whom he had given the money in order to find out what they had gained with it." And this parable at this point follows the normal formula that you'd imagine, with the servants making various amounts of money, having taken various amounts of risk, and then being rewarded according to how much profit they were able to bring back. And the last servant hid the money because he knew that this king was vicious and that he reaped where he did not sow and gathered where he did not deposit, which means he stole from people. He was ruthless and he took from his people, and this guy was scared of him, scared of losing the money. And then the king said to those standing by, "Take his mina away from him and give it to the one who has 10. "Sir," they said, "he already has 10. He replied, "I tell you that everyone who has, more will be given. But as for one who has nothing, even what they have will be taken away. But those enemies of mine who did not want me to be king over them, bring them here and kill them before me." This is one of the weirder iterations of this parable. Probably why it doesn't show up in the lectionary and people don't preach on it. But Jesus was using this 30 years after the fact. But people still knew what he was talking about. Imagine, if you will, I started a parable with, there once was a president that was so paranoid that he paid burglars to sneak into the opposition's headquarters and steal, right? You know exactly who I'm talking about at that point. And just the tone of which I say these things lets you know that I'm not being very kind to Nixon. And so this is both a lesson in Jesus about being faithful with what you have, which is typically how we preach it, but it's also giving an opportunity to just take a jab at the Herodians, because as we said last week, Jesus is supposed to be presented in the Gospels as the anti-Herodian, that Herod is the king of the Jews in the way that humans do kingdoms, and Jesus is the king of the Jews in the way that heavens do kingdoms. And so Jesus takes a couple of opportunities, actually. He calls one of the Herods a fox, and he says, "I'll do what I want to do. This guy has no power over me." Like, Jesus does not get along with the Herodians at all. And to be fair, Archelaus is so awful that he only lasts 10 years in the position. And when wide-scale riots and the people say, get this guy out of here, Rome, instead of putting in another client king, just decides to make Judea a Roman province. And so the lands of Samaria, Judea, and Idumea become the Roman province of Judea, leaving, those northern places of Galilee and upwards to stay with Philip and with Herod Antipas. But Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, where all the people and the money are, that becomes a Roman province. And now, it would stay a Roman province throughout all of Jesus' life. And so this is kind of important about who is in charge of Judea at this point. So at this point is 6 AD, and this is the newly formed Roman province of Judea. And Caesar Augustus orders a decree that a census be taken under the supervision of the governor Quirinius. But wait, I hear you saying from across the internet, didn't you say 6 AD? Isn't this in the Christmas story? Don't we read about this every single Christmas in Luke? Isn't this the reason why Mary and Joseph have to leave Nazareth and go down to Bethlehem to be counted in his ancestral homeland, and Mary has to have the baby in a stable and all of that? Yeah, this is that same census, and it is kind of a historical problem for people who hold to biblical inerrancy, as in that there's no errors in the way that the stories in the Bible are portrayed, no factual errors anyway. Because this census was pretty clearly recorded in multiple sources. Luke is kind of the only source that puts it much earlier. And like we said before, Herod had this sweetheart deal with Rome where there were no Roman taxes in Judea. And so if there was no Roman taxes, then there'd be no reason to have a Roman census. And Herod is clearly very alive when Jesus is born. And we know pretty clearly that Jesus was born roughly the time that Herod died. Also, if Mary and Joseph were living in Galilee, then they would be under Herod Antipas's rule, and when the census came, it wouldn't affect them because they didn't live in the jurisdiction of Judea. And so it's kind of two strikes against Luke's narration. So what gives? Well, my wife told me, don't you ruin Christmas. We are already ruining Christmas this year. Don't you dare ruin the Christmas story for these people. But I can't help it, okay? It's not ruined. We just need to look at the story a little bit differently. I promise, okay? The Gospel of Luke was written at about 85 AD by Luke, who was a physician probably from somewhere in Syria. And everything in his gospel is secondhand. He's a pretty good reporter. He's talking to a bunch of sources. He didn't see any of this. And so he's piecing together the truths, the facts, and he's trying to create a narrative that makes sense. And so we know that Jesus was born in Bethlehem and he grew up in Nazareth. So he's got that Judean and Galilean life in there. And so there has to be a way that he has both of those in the story. And we know that there was a census, and we know that it caused a ton of chaos in that time period. And okay, that's fine. So in Luke, there's a census, and they have to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem, where there's no room, and Jesus is born in a stable, and then shepherds come and visit, and then they take Jesus to the temple to be dedicated and circumcised, and that's where they meet two prophets. They prophesy over Jesus, and then they go home to Nazareth. That's the story in Luke. In Matthew, they're already living in Bethlehem when Jesus is born somewhat uneventfully at home. And sometime later, the Magi visit, and Herod overreacts, ordering the death of all the baby boys in Bethlehem. So the family runs away to Egypt, where they stay until Herod's death. But because Archelaus is a total train wreck, they move to Galilee instead, where they're out of his reach, and they're with the much more even-tempered Herod Antipas. So when we tell the Christmas story in church, we typically squash those two stories together and we imagine that they both happened. But just in terms of their own internal timelines, they can't both have happened the way that they're described. I mean, the timelines don't match up. They don't fit, even even without knowing the date of the census, they don't fit together. But certainly, I'm not the first person to notice that. Certainly, the people who put together the canon noticed that these two birth narratives were in conflict with each other and that they couldn't both be factually correct. So, why did the early church allow these two birth narratives to commingle instead of choosing the most accurate one and cutting the other one out? Because, as I've said before, very early on in this series, ancient history is much more interested with truth than with fact. Modern history cares about fact. We care who did what year, what they said, what they did, what their name was, and we care a lot about the fact. And we say, let the truth telling, be up to the people who interpret history after the fact. That's a modern illusion, and it's not even all that accurate. All you have to do is study an American textbook to know that facts are not always the actual facts of history. So the ancient writers were much more concerned about the truth behind the thing. Sure, the main bones of the story are definitely true, they're consistent, but the truth it's trying to convey is what's important in these. And those truths are that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, in Judea, and he grew up in Nazareth of Galilee. The truth is that he was born powerless. He was a peasant pawn whose destiny was swayed by powerful and often awful men. The truth is that despite there being a handful of powerful men who ruled the world, God was working behind the scenes to turn the world upside down through common people, through good people, through people who will never have the great after their names. But as I often say, great men are rarely good men, and God works primarily with good people and not with great people. So remember that as we tell the Christmas story again this year, that the details of the story are malleable. So the truth can be expressed in ways that can make meaning out of our lives. And if there's ever been a year where we need the freedom to reinterpret the Christmas story, it's got to be this year. Has there ever been in your lifetime a Christmas more disjointed? A Christmas that evokes more conflicting and strange feelings than this one? And I wonder then, as you read these Christmas narratives in Luke and in Matthew, and then there are some other ones out there too, but the two canonical ones, what are the feelings that these evoke this year that they didn't evoke in the past? What are the parts of these stories that stand out more to you now than they did before? I wonder. And as we go through this Christmas season, I'm sure that we're going to find new ways that the story is being redefined. And I'm really excited to hear them and to talk with you, hopefully on a Thursday over Zoom. Speaking of what's coming down the road in a week or two, you know who was definitely not a fan of the census under Quirinius? A man named Judas of Galilee. This guy, Judas of Galilee, is about to start an armed uprising in the name of Jewish freedom and independence from tyranny. He will evoke the spirit of Judas Maccabees and that revolt that gave them freedom from the Seleucids. They will try to conjure up that same spirit, to catch lightning in a bottle once again, to free their people in the Messianic age, to bring about the age of God, and will do so and cause all kinds of chaos and tumult that will directly affect Jesus. This Judas fella, his followers then start this sect called the Zealots. There's a splinter group called the Sicarii. Jesus has a zealot in his 12. And the ideologies of this revolutionary group will shape the next 100 years pretty dramatically, will possibly lead to Jesus' crucifixion, and then later the destruction of Jerusalem and the scattering of the church throughout the entire world. So it's kind of a big deal, kind of an important story for understanding the New Testament. But, well, we don't have time today, so you'll have to check back again next week. I'll see you then. All right. You can unmute yourself now. And what I'm sure you have some clarifying questions, things that weren't explained very well or that were breezed over. Or not.
All I
Or
can
too many.
all I can say is I'm more confused now than I was before. I rather remember the Christmas story as it was taught as I was brought up. You know what I mean? So, like you said, they should have separated them. You know.
Yeah, that's one of the early on in my life, when reading through the Bible as, I don't know, a teenager or so, I I think every Christian that wants to read through the Bible starts in Genesis, and then they get bored, and then
Yeah.
they're like, well, I'll read the New Testament, and they
No.
make it through Matthew, and then you get to Mark, and Mark does not have a birth story,
No.
and then you get to Luke, and you read another birth story, and John does not have a birth story either. So it's just Matthew and Luke. But Matthew and Luke only have some of the nativity story, and they don't have the other one.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember reading it and thinking, wait a second. So, all right, I get the whole, there was a census under Quirinius, and you had to go to your ancestral homeland, and so they go to Bethlehem, and there's no room in the inn, and I've done that pageant before. But then after the shepherd's visit, it just says, 8 days later, they go to the temple to have Jesus dedicated and circumcised. You've got the two prophets, whose names I am blanking on. The one who says, my eyes have seen the Savior, I can die in peace.
Yeah.
That Simeon, and Anna is the other one. And Jesus does his dedication, and then it says they go home to Nazareth. And I remember reading that and thinking, wait, no, they're supposed to go back home, and then the Magi come, and then they have to run away to Egypt. And then he goes home from there. And I remember that confusing me early on, but learning that, don't ask questions. Smarter people than you are in charge, and certainly they have a good answer for this. So that being said, I'm still going to tell the Christmas story the way that I want to.
Why not? Everybody else did.
That's right.
Because the power of a story is not.
It's not in possession, it's what's happening, not as in chronological order or anything, but it's what happens because of it.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the things that happen in it are historically plausible things. So it's not like, Mary goes to Bethlehem where she's abducted by aliens, and they're responding to things that really caused a lot of chaos in those days. And so I think of like we just had Thanksgiving, and I've seen Charlie Brown Thanksgiving, I know the story. I know this wonderful coming together of the Pilgrims and the Indians, and that they share knowledge with each other, and the Native Americans help the Pilgrims survive the first harsh winter, and the Pilgrims bring this freedom and technology, and there's this togetherness, and it's a story that we need to hear every November, and we need to come together and have a story that unites us in this sense of togetherness and Thanksgiving. I also know, having studied history, that it didn't happen. And the relationship between the British settlers and the natives were a
It's not
little less peaceful,
not
you know,
very good.
to put it nicely. Um, but like, I think the story still has merit as long as we understand that there are other stories at play. You know, like the story of William Penn. We can forget about the Pilgrims. William Penn learned the language of the Lenape people so that he could negotiate land on their terms and treat them as equals and not as savages to be taken advantage of. And he brokered a peace that lasted until his idiot son took over. There's a good story. We should tell the story of William Penn.
On Thanksgiving.
So can you think, we'll come back to piecing together the Christmas story maybe, but can you think of times in the Bible where you have heard about a Herod? We've got the Magi coming to King Herod,
Right.
the Great. Off the top of your head, I know, pop Bible quiz, I'm sorry. But other times you've heard of a Herod.
Is Herod the one that John the Baptist, right? What
Mhm.
about, wasn't Jesus brought before Herod at crucifixion? He sent him to Caesar.
Yes. So
That's
so both of those are the same Herod. That's Herod's son, Herod Antipas, who
okay.
rules in Galilee until like 37 AD. So he takes over when Jesus is a baby and is the ruler of Galilee for Jesus's entire life. And so if Jesus had a king, it would be this guy, Herod Antipas, who's not that bad as far as Herods go, which is a low bar, I know. But he steals, this Herod steals his brother's wife, who is also technically his niece. And then, the best part is that woman is named Herodias. So, Herod and Herodias. And then, just to make it more confusing, and she has a daughter so that's his niece. But then because he took her as his wife, also his daughter-in-law, who, or stepdaughter, who is dancing for him while he's drunk and he's all hot and bothered and says, I'll give you half of anything you want. And she goes, I want John the Baptist's head on a plate. Because John had the audacity to speak out against Herod for all of his lusty ways. And then so when Jesus is then on trial later, they go, oh, he's a Galilean. He's not even a part of our precinct. Like, we have no jurisdiction over him because we're in Jerusalem. This is Judea. So if it's like he's Canadian. Like, you need to send him up to Canada to be judged, not here. Extradite him. And then so that Herod would just so happen to be in town for Passover. And so they brought him before him, and that Herod is like, I'm on vacation, guys. Don't make me do business. And so that's the same Herod who executes He executes John because John is baptizing on his territory. So that's his jurisdiction. And then he's in Jerusalem for Passover when Jesus is arrested. And so they bring him before him to say, hey, this guy's from your part up in Galilee. You handle him. And Jesus refuses to speak to him. And so he says, I don't want him, send him back to Pilate. So that's the same Herod.
It's
You
the
look-
same three different times is the same Herod. Is that? Oh, I'm lost.
So Jesus as a baby, that's Herod the
Okay.
Great. That's Daddy. That's Daddy Herod. The guy who builds all the
Okay.
temples and the aqueducts. That's the big wig Daddy Herod. The one we meet
Okay.
that the Magi come to when Jesus is a baby.
Okay.
Jesus grows up and he has a run-in. John has a run-in with him, and then Jesus does at his crucifixion. That's Herod Antipas. He's the king of Galilee up north.
He's the son of the first one.
Yes.
Am I? Okay.
Yeah.
I need a score sheet.
Right? The Herod that's in charge of Judea, we only ever meet in passing in Matthew when Jesus is born and his family runs to Egypt. And then we hear that Herod has died, you can come home. But they also hear that Herod's son Archelaus is in Judea and he's awful. So he's worse than his dad. So they bypassed Judea and went up to Galilee because Herod Antipas was a little bit more stable. But you don't have to know about Archelaus because he's gone in a couple years. And that's when the Romans take over and they just make it a province. And so when we meet Pontius Pilate at Jesus's trial, Pontius Pilate is a Roman prefect. He's not the governor, but he's in charge of the area. And so he's a Roman in charge of Judea because Judea is no longer an independent nation. It's a Roman province at that point. But then, then there's a Herod that persecutes the early church in the book of Acts, and is called King Herod, and an angel strikes him dead and worms eat his body.
Oh.
In the book of Acts 19, 21, somewhere in there. That is I don't want to say Antipater. Herod. That's Herod's grandson, who was
Which Herod?
Herod the Great, Herod the granddaddy. His grandson, Herod Agrippa. That's it. Herod Agrippa, who grew up in Rome and was best friends with Caligula when they were kids. And so when Caligula becomes the emperor of Rome, he's like, oh, my buddy Agrippa, I should make him king. And then so he makes Herod's grandson king of Judea, persecutes the church, and then he dies. Historians think of a stroke, but Acts says he got killed by an angel.
Oh.
It was sudden, one way or the other. So when you read the New Testament, if it is Jesus is a baby, that's Herod the Great, Herod the megalomaniac, Herod the builder, Herod the big guy. If it is John the Baptist or Jesus's trial, that's his son Herod Antipas. If it is the early church, that's his grandson Herod Agrippa. All of them demonstrate what it means to be an earthly king. They're all strong in terms of like military might and suppression and strength in that way. None of them show a whole lot of mercy or love or compassion. They don't seem to want to understand the plight of their people. And things don't always go well for them because of that. There's a lot of disconnection between them and their people. And so Jesus, as I've said, is presented as the anti-Herod. So if Herod represents what earthly kings, what earthly power does, what kind of person it creates and it attracts, Jesus represents the opposite of that,
Opposite.
right? So like,
Right.
what kind of a leader is in the kingdom? Is somebody who's the servant of all, not somebody who has the sharpest sword.
And he's going to try and get along with everybody and not cause problems.
Well, cause the right kinds of problems, I think. Jesus always stands up for the underdog, and he's willing to get into trouble on behalf of somebody, but not get into trouble for his own benefit.
Which most rulers don't do. Very few rulers are leaders of the countries now. Basically don't care too much about the people.
No.
They want more power and wealth and whatever else they can attain.
That's right.
It's intoxicating from what I hear. Once people start treating you a certain way, then good people tend to lose track of why they're there in the first place.
Yeah.
Good pastors do the same, I've seen. They forget why they came into the ministry in the first place because they've been used to being seen as a power, as an authority figure. Sometimes we need to be humbled as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a theme too in all of the birth stories of Jesus, is how humble he is in those circumstances.
Right. He wasn't born into wealth or anything like that. He was just a regular person.
And you think of how uncomfortable those magi must have been too, of how well dressed we always make them in the nativity, and they're preparing.
That's another thing.
Yeah.
I went and looked up, like, we were talking about Rome and like Jerusalem. That's 1,400 miles over land. So, traveling distances like that, and then from wherever they came from in Babylon, right? The Magi came from, that's probably 500 miles to Jerusalem or wherever.
Yeah.
So I'm sure they didn't come all gussied up, because didn't they have to go through a desert?
That's a good point. They probably brought a change of clothes.
But where are they going to change?
Like they get to the palace in their traveling clothes and they go, okay, where's your changing room? We got to put on our fancy shoes. But then when they go to Bethlehem, that's right. Are they back in their changing clothes, or like their traveling clothes, or are they all in their glittery things like we have? That's a good question.
I mean, if you travel 500 miles on camel and you're coming through a desert, right?
Yeah.
And there's probably no place to clean up and wash up.
Probably not until you get into town. And, I imagine they had money. And
so maybe they bought their gifts there when they got there.
Oh, maybe they bought them there.
Yeah. Or maybe they bought their clothes there too. That's another thing.
So they all brought gold, and two of them were like, oh, we can't all give them the same thing. So we need to go buy some new presents with our gold. I like to imagine how like these fancy schmancy gussied up people in their glittery outfits having to walk into Bethlehem, and not into the nice part of Bethlehem, into like the slums of Bethlehem, where they're like having to look around street corners and like, are we in the right part of town? This doesn't feel right. This and then they get there and they've got camel. They've got like horse poop on their feet, and
Right.
I like that. I like that a lot, actually. Um, like imagine the Queen of England is going to pay homage to some royal birth, and she has to meet the baby in a porta potty or something.
Well, I'm watching that movie on Netflix, The Crown,
Oh yeah, yeah.
and Queen Elizabeth, I mean, she doesn't dress herself. She has a maid that comes in and puts her clothes on for her. And now, I don't know if that's what happens, but this is ridiculous.
I think it's season 1 of that show where she's unsure about like wanting to do it, and her mother is telling her that it is her God-given duty and responsibility, and that the
Right,
people need somebody to look at, and it is um, it's almost like our curse, our duty to society to be that sparkling image, and how it's divinely appointed for the kings and queens to be that. And I thought, man, what kind of like now
they actually,
there's a story, right?
they're actually, when she, when she's crowned, she's actually taking an oath in the church
Hmm.
to to follow God.
Mhm.
The king or queen of England is also the head of the Anglican Church.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize that. So I'm
Yeah.
learning a lot of new things by watching some of this stuff.
Well, wasn't the Church of England founded because the king wanted to divorce his wife and the Pope wouldn't let him?
I
And
think
so
so.
he's like, I'll make my own church.
Something like that.
Uh, yeah.
Mm.
So, and and if you look back, if you watch some of those shows on that are like the, I can't say the word now. When you go back and they look into how the cities were back in like Jerusalem and stuff, when they do
Mm,
the archaeology stuff, some
mm.
of those buildings, I mean, it's like some areas are really elaborate and others are not. I mean, it's like, how could they exist? It seems like, compared to what we have, that we have to deal with.
You know, the ancient Minoans who lived on Crete, um, I want to say 4,000 years ago, maybe more, 5,000 years ago, had 3-story buildings with hot and cold running water
Oh,
and like toilets. And yeah, the White House didn't get a toilet until like uh, the 1900s. Like they
wow,
were still had an outhouse. So
wow.
like it, there were some places where there was some pretty advanced technology, and it was actually pretty cushy to live.
Huh,
But then there were also, like you said, it's not evenly distributed.
right. Huh,
I also learned recently that there were, you know how we have like single-use cups and stuff that we
throw
use
away.
and throw them away?
Right.
They had that too. They had single-use pots, like ceramics that were cheaply made for the use of like buying a bit of wine or buying some food, and it comes in this cheap ceramic thing, and
Huh.
once you take it out of the ceramic you throw it in a pile somewhere. And so there are these archaeological piles where it's just it's like a mountain of broken pottery.
So they
Because
didn't recycle.
no, like you might have a really nice pot that you reuse, but then you go to the store and it's the equivalent of getting plastic bags at the grocery store. So when I learned that, I was like, oh, so we've always been wasteful. Okay.
It's
This is
not
not
something
just
fun
us.
then, right?
Oh, that's lovely. That makes me feel better.
So things don't really change a whole lot throughout history.
No.
You know, that's one of my favorite things about studying history is when I get to relate to the people back then. And I realize that we're so similar and that they survived. and they thrived, and they went through hell and they went through heaven, and things went up and they went down and they went sideways, and people prevailed over it all. And especially in church history, that the church has been dragged through the
Mm.
mud, and sometimes it dragged itself through the mud, and it's been through rocky times and it's been through glorious times, and it keeps going. And so I refuse to acknowledge any story that people tell about inevitable church death and decline, because I studied
Always be
history, and I know that this is a cycle, and we regroup and we reconcentrate, and then we come out firing on all cylinders. Like, this is what happens, and we're just at the leading edge of something new and exciting that God is going to do, because God's been doing it all throughout history.
okay. He threw a monkey wrench into our life right now with the pandemic. So
It's just accelerating trends that have already been happening, and so now we get to see it happen a little quicker. We've been saying, God's been saying, church, you need to get out of your walls and see the world. You need to realize that you are not just special, and you need to get out there. And then we're like, I don't know. And now he's like, well,
we're all connected, and
yeah.
whatever each of us does, or whoever we associate with, is broadening. I mean, you just can't stay an island, because we're all dependent on each other, no matter what you think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking that the other day, like, there's the people that keep my electricity going. There's people that keep my water running in the house. There's people that make the sewage work. And if we didn't have all of those people together, we wouldn't be here. There'd be more problems. So,
the
this
pandemic really showed us that too, right?
What?
Well, there's a shortage of toilet paper early on. And that's not just because people hoarded it. It's because there are supply chains, and there's all of these different systems that depend on other systems that depend on other systems. And we're all so interconnected. So when China got hit, a lot of our supply chains got hit. And those are people.
Right.
Those are people that had a part in bringing that toilet paper to your house that you'll never know. And
there's also the people that grew the trees that made the toilet paper.
Yeah, you can take it all the way back.
If you go right back down to the nitty gritty, it's back to a person. Each of us exists because each other exists.
That's a beautiful word.
So you can kind of figure, your existence and my existence depends on somebody else's existence.
That's true. Yep.
One of the recent interpretations of the Luke Christmas story that I keep seeing is a re-examining of the Greek word that we sometimes say stable, in where Jesus was born, and the word inn. There's no room in the inn, so you can go to the stable. That it's not the typical word you would use for a hotel. It is more typically used in the Greek world to mean the guest room. And in a lot of these houses that we're excavating in the area, it seems that the bottom floor of the house was a living area, but at night they brought some of the animals into that bottom floor living area, and the sleeping area was upstairs away from the animals. And so this new interpretation I keep reading all the time is that what happened is, sorry, Mary, there's no room for you in the guest room because we're all flooded with relatives. We're going to have to get you a room downstairs. And so Mary and Joseph are still in a house, and they're still surrounded by their family, their extended family, and the family's animals. And it's all happening in this big bustling house full of cousins and aunties and uncles and grandparents, and everyone is present. And it's this, it's a whole different story than um, this scared couple out in the wilderness in a barn by themselves.
Okay.
It is a story much more about uh, adapting to difficult circumstances and your family being there for you. And all that just because of two different words. Both are equally as valid interpretations of the story.
Right.
I like that one better this year because I miss being in houses jam-packed with people where I have to sleep on the floor because there's no beds left. I miss my guest room being occupied.
Yeah. And all the rowdy kids around.
Mm. All of those aunties and uncles pinching Jesus's cheeks and
My
saying,
grandkids.
yeah, yeah, that's a story I can tell.